As I mentioned earlier, our information about current events around the world is largely supplied by the mainstream media in the form of something they call the news. We have daily newspapers and TV and radio news broadcasts that are transmitted throughout the day and night. Our understanding of these current events is largely formed by these same providers of the so-called news. Of course, there's the internet, a wonderful world-changing invention that enables us to obtain good information from a billion other sources. But for most people with busy lives and limited understanding of how the world really works, finding the time or desire to search through all the limitless possibilities is simply not possible. In other words, the mainstream news providers that we're conditioned to trust not only to serve as our eyes and ears to the world around us, to a very large extent also serve as our brains, telling us how to interpret the information they provide. It's fairly obvious that this puts these organizations in a position of very considerable power, controlling not only the type of information we receive, but also controlling what we think about that information. I shall now try to show how none of the mainstream media can be trusted to have this position of considerable power. When we learn something new, the history of it is invariably a good place to begin. The finest book I know of that describes the history of modern news broadcasting, from our perspective that is, the perspective of the 99%, is called The First Casualty by Philip Knightley. This book should be essential reading in every schoolroom in the world because it provides dozens of fine examples of many of the points I'm making in this talk. It takes its title from a quotation attributed to Senator Hiram Johnson, who, in 1917, said, "The first casualty when war comes is truth." If we consider that Britain has been in a state of permanent war for at least 300 years, and even longer if we also include all of Britain's domestic wars, it's fairly plain to see that truth has been a very long-suffering casualty in this country for many, many centuries. The intimate connection with war and lie-telling by our trusted leaders is very well known by those of us who study these things. Winston Churchill, for example, observed that, "In war, truth is so precious, she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." I repeat the important point I made earlier. Given the length of time that Britain has been at war, it's clear to see that lie-telling by our trusted leaders, great heroes such as Winston Churchill, is completely routine for them. Knightley's book focuses on the recent history of some of the numerous lies told mainly by newspapers at times of war, beginning in the 1850s with the Crimean War. But it was the American Civil War, however, that set the abysmally low standards of reporting accuracy that has not only not improved over the years, but has become even worse. The Civil War was covered by more newspapers who used more reporters to work on it than had ever happened in any previous war. In the cutthroat world of newspaper selling, telling the truth quickly assumed second place in importance to telling some sensationalist war story, and the more lurid, the better, no matter if it was true. Knightley quotes the American academic J. Cutler Andrews writing the following in the 1950s about the Civil War, and I quote, "Sensationalism and exaggeration, outright lies, puffery, slander, faked eyewitness accounts, and conjectures built on pure imagination cheapened much that passed in the North for news." As the close relationship between war and profit made itself apparent to newspaper proprietors almost as much as it did to arms makers, the media moguls and their unscrupulous reporters developed the art of making up the news rather than merely reporting it. Knightley cites one H.M. Stanley as being, and I quote, "not above starting his own small wars in Africa and then reporting on them." And the powerful American media mogul William Randolph Hearst was a significant influence in ensuring the Spanish-American War in 1898 became a reality. Before the war started, Hearst sent an illustrator, Frederick Remington, to Cuba to create sensationalist pictures that could be used to accompany the sensationalist stories of his reporters. When Remington failed to find anything that was remotely warlike, he asked to return home in a telegram that read, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." Hearst replied, "Please remain. You furnish pictures, I will furnish war. As the circulation and profits of Hearst's war stories skyrocketed, Knightley observes that correspondents' copy had to match the headlines, and some took to such gross exaggeration that a New York Herald man insisted there was a factory out there for faking war news. The advent of moving pictures at the turn of the century would of course be capitalized on by the media, who immediately recognized the potential of the new technology to spread their falsehoods. Knightley tells of an early newsreel film shown to British audiences during the Boer War that depicts a Red Cross tent under fire from the Boers, whilst brave British doctors, nurses and orderlies try to treat a wounded soldier. But the film was a fake, shot with actors at Hampstead Heath, a suburb of London. The First World War marked yet another stage in the rapidly declining moral standards of the mainstream news, which were never high to begin with. For it was World War I that advanced the growing symbiotic relationship between politicians and those who the 99% relied on to tell them what was happening. The catalogue of outright lies published during that outrageous 4-year-long slaughter is truly breathtaking. Arthur Ponsonby, who was once a British MP, wrote an entire book on the subject titled Falsehood in Wartime. The intimate collusion between government and trusted news providers was firmly established during World War I, as both parties realised the huge profits that could be made by duping the public. Knightley once again provides the following terrific example from the Times newspaper, which was as highly respected for its honesty 100 years ago as it still is today. When the Bolsheviks defeated Tsarist Russia, they discovered the top-secret agreements made between Russia and the European powers, showing how the world was to be carved up between the winners once Germany was defeated. The treaties were dynamite, detailing, for example, how France would have a free hand in Western Europe, providing Russia was given Poland, and showing how England had betrayed its Arab allies in the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France. The Bolsheviks made the documents public, and Morgan Phillips Price, a Russian-speaking journalist working for the Manchester Guardian in Russia, saw them and, recognizing the explosive implications, wrote a report about them for his newspaper, which was published in November 1917, a year before the war ended. But the story was pretty much spiked by the rest of the British press, ensuring that the British people would remain, then as now, in gloomy ignorance. Quoting from the history of the Times, Knightley tells how this great institution decided not to inconvenience the British, French and Italian governments, and to maintain silence about the secret treaties. As the governments themselves were bound by the treaties to be silent, the Times decided it could only follow their example. So it's very plain to see that from its earliest days our trusted media has never concerned itself overmuch with telling the truth to the 99%, subordinating its allegiance then as now to the 1% instead. But this is yet another one of the many important history lessons that never makes it into the classroom, which means that we all grow up thinking that those who provide us with the news, our very eyes and ears to the world around us, those who supply the first draft of what will become the history lessons of the future, can be trusted to tell the truth. But the fact is, they can't. I was talking to a young chap the other day. Let's call him Dave. We didn't know each other at the time, and I'd been telling him that I was a writer. Dave showed polite interest, and then said something to the effect of how lucky we are to be able to read and write whatever we like. I opened my mouth to answer, but how do you summarize all the information that's in this talk in a few casual sentences for someone who's in the dark about it all? And anyway, it wasn't the time and place to try. My heart went out to Dave, as it does to all young people who have no idea how much trouble their generation is in. And I just said, To some extent, we do indeed enjoy some freedom of information, so much so that most young people, like Dave, think we can read and write what we like. The really clever thing, the thing that makes most modern governments a little more advanced than previous more tyrannical versions, is that people are indeed allowed to read and write what they want, so long as their reading and writing has no effect. Because no one much cares what the 99% read or write. Given the information they're supplied with by the 1%, whatever the 99% read and write will inevitably be harmless to the 1%. So what if a few strange cranks find the time and have the inclination to look beyond the wall-to-wall distractions and deceit provided for them 24/7 by the 1%? So long as no one pays any attention to them, let them read and write what they like. Their numbers are too small to worry about. Why draw attention to them by oppressing them? You have to hand it to the 1%. It's pretty clever stuff. However, as soon as something does appear in the mainstream the 1% do not like, usually by virtue of the internet, we get a much better idea of what the 1% really think about freedom of expression. Ask Julian Assange, or Chelsea Manning, or Edward Snowden, to name just a few of the best-known examples. Western controls of the information we receive are achieved with various subtle and cynical devices, which have largely replaced the ruthless brutality of Tudor England, say, or the crude methods of propaganda and outright censorship used 100 years ago by the likes of William Hearst. Today, public relations experts have honed and perfected the use of the carefully crafted lie and half-truth, together with the gentle art of controlling the precise timing of when and how sensitive information is drip-fed into the public domain. Even with the creation of the so-called Freedom of Information Act in 2000, another fine piece of deceptive language, by the way, which supposedly made public access to public records easier, the 1% were not to be sidestepped, and have shackled this phantom key to the secrets cupboard with miles of red tape and locked it securely behind a wall of exemptions, a multitude of situations where the act can be rendered useless. The Freedom of Information Act has perhaps made government departments a little more cagey about what they leave lying around for possible prying eyes. Perhaps this was the main reason it was created in the first place. For example, the recording of proper minutes in meetings was effectively forbidden in many government offices at about the same time that the Freedom of Information Act was invented, sometimes replaced by action points instead, which is an entirely different beast altogether. Internal emails are ruthlessly policed, seriously inhibiting one's inclination to use the tool at all, and most public servants are forbidden to talk to the press. For example, in 2005, Paul Lewis, a nurse in Grantham, desperately ashamed of the substandard care he was obliged to administer, was suspended from work for 3 months and faced dismissal for the sin of writing a letter to his local newspaper, which sounded a warning that British healthcare had deteriorated to third world standards. Today, almost 10 years later, the NHS, the one good thing done for the 99% by a previous government, is on the verge of extinction, which was pretty much what Paul Lewis warned about, and for which he was ruthlessly persecuted even.